Hello, welcome everybody. This is a tutorial video on the readings which you have done for class 2 and class 3, which are kind of the introductory readings to our course. I'm gonna summarize and explain some of the main ideas. So let's start by reflecting on assumed ideas we have about language and about what language is. So there's kind of a popular view of language as an empty vehicle that conveys persisting meanings about the world, as Laura Ahern tells us. And Laura Ahern is a linguistic anthropologist that works at Rutgers University. So this popular idea thinks about language reduced to a set of formal rules and language reduced to the idea of a code to communicate messages. And you might wonder, where does this idea come from? Well, this idea comes mainly from two sources, as Ahern explains in her text. The first one is Ferdinand de Saussure, who is a linguist, a Swiss linguist in the 19th century, who was kind of the person who started the discipline of linguistics worldwide. And what he did is that, as he was very interested in this formal aspect of language, he separated language into two categories, which he called langue and parole. So he was interested in what he called langue, which for him was the abstract systematic rules and conventions of a signifying system. And he left aside what he called parole, which was the concrete instances of the use of language, so real and actual language use. So if you think about chess, and I think this metaphor helps a bit to understand this idea, one thing would be like what we actually do when playing a certain game of chess, and then long, what Saussure was interested in would be kind of like the rules that exist to play chess. And then another very important figure who contributed to this idea of the reduction of language to a set of formal rules is another famous linguist who is called Noam Chomsky, and who is an American linguist working at MIT, and who was also and is also, because he's alive, very interested in the formal properties of the system of language. So what happens? This idea, these assumptions, this separation misses the richness and complexity of of one of the most fundamental aspects of human existence, which is language. So if we ask ourselves, as Ahern asks us, what must one person know in order to know a language? So think about a language you know, and then think what different things you need to know in order to know that language. So on the one hand, you need to know phonology, so the sounds of the language. You need to know morphology, which is kind of word formation in the language. You also need to know syntax, so sentence construction. You also need to know semantics, which is the meaning of words. You need to know pragmatics, which are the social norms about using that language. So what Ahern is telling us and making us think about this question is that using language means engaging in a form of social action which is laden with cultural values. So this is starting to give us the idea, or to introduce us to the idea, that language is a social practice, and that words and languages live socially charged lives the same way that every social interaction is mediated by language somehow. And therefore, language is not a neutral medium for communication, but is more like a set of socially embedded practices. And To verify this idea, Ahern explains to us that there are more than 7,000 languages in the world, and they are all, what they have in common is that they are very diverse because they relate to cultural and social practices in the specific geographical and cultural context where they are spoken. So Ahern tells us some examples at the beginning, and you had an assignment about them last class that describe situations in which neither a linguistic analysis alone or a sociocultural analysis alone would be enough to understand what's going on. So the thing is that the perspectives and tools that linguistic anthropology offers us can shed light on this kind of situation and on broader social and cultural uses. So we can look at social and cultural uses through language. Language is inherently social, so it's not just a means through which we act upon the world, but it's itself a form of social action too. So, connecting with this idea, today you read a text by Malinowski, who is a Polish anthropologist who was the founder of social anthropology in Europe. So, in the US, the same way in the US, we have Boas starting the discipline. In Europe, it was Malinowski who, in the 20s, last century, so 100 years ago, started the professional discipline of anthropology. So, of course, it's a very old text and it implies it's problematic in a lot of different ways. But what is interesting for us is how he, at the beginning of these methodologies and theories, he starts asking himself about the role of language in the community he was studying in the Pacific, right? So the first idea that he reaches is that language creates ties that are necessary for unified social action. So he observes language and he sees that sometimes that language is the necessary means of communion that is needed to develop a certain social action. But then he goes a step further as he notices that in certain situations that he's observing, language is actually not really serving to communicate a thought or a meaning, but to create social bonds. And he calls this phatic communion, and he says he defines it as a type of speech in which ties of union are created by the exchange of words. And this is very important because this is a person who 100 years ago was observing language and realizes that, okay, no, there's something else going on here. These people are speaking, but what they're saying is not really important. What is important is that through this conversation, they are creating bonds. They are establishing themselves as a community. They are telling each other, hey, you can trust me. I'm part of your community too, even if they are not saying that. But that's the function that language is having in those certain communicate types of communication. So once more, as he says, language appears to us in this function not as an instrument of reflection, but as a mode of action. So for him, this is a mode of action that serves, as I was saying, to do unified social action, but also to create social bonds, which are essential for societies to survive. Okay, and then turning to the other reading you did for today, which was written by Hanks, but William Hanks, who is a linguist and a linguistic anthropologist working at Berkeley. So he, in this text, I think I assign it because I think it shows very well how a lot of things that we understand when we understand language are due to common sense that we have because of our knowledge of the context. So, as linguist anthropologists, at least as linguist anthropologists in this course, you are all linguist anthropologists now for this semester. It's very important to start alienating ourselves from that common sense and learn to observe conversations that take place around us from the point of view of a linguistic anthropologist who is trying to not only to understand the meaning as we do in our everyday interactions, but to understand um, what things we need to know about that context, about that social and cultural context, to understand what's going on in that conversation. Okay, so what they are saying, and Ahern and Malinowski mentioned this too, is that the essence of language cannot be understood without reference to the particular social context in which it's used. And Malinowski asks us this question about this conversation he introduces about the canoa. I don't know if you remember. And they saying, okay, he says, okay, so if you were observing a conversation in a very different culture, and you had a translator that was conveying the meaning of each word, would you understand the conversation? And he says, certainly not. Why? Because to understand a conversation, you need to understand the context of the conversation in a very broad way, like the social context, what certain things mean in that culture, in that society, the ways, the norms of communication, and what they they tell us about other social and cultural practices in that society. So that's the main idea that I want you to start like trying to alienate yourselves from that common sense ideas. And just to finish, the other two things that he mentioned that I think are really important and that we also need to start learning to notice them and not and understand their role they have in communication are silence on the one hand, pauses, silence, and gesture on the other. So how many things in conversation um, we understand because of the gestures, the body posture, and our movements while we say them. Okay, well, so these are some first very important ideas that I want you to start considering about language as a social action, language as a social practice, and about the social and cultural importance of language and about some important notions to learn, to observe, and understand the processes that we are going to study in this course. Thank you very much. I hope you have enjoyed the readings.